When many think about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, often images of Hernan Cortez and a greedy handful of conquistadors toppling the peace-loving Aztec Empire all by themselves and by force flash before their mind. Often, the Spaniards are charged with willfully committing a genocide and other atrocities against the native inhabitants, with mere economic gain as their goal. This is not only a very simplistic but also largely ahistorical, at times patently false, summation of the events. There are various myths surrounding the conquest which still linger with us in the modern zeitgeist. These myths have consequences and were mostly born out of both anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic bigotry and benefited the geopolitical enemies of Spain at the time and then later Mexico itself, along with the other Spanish-speaking countries. In this video, we'll debunk the common myths surrounding the conquest, many of them born from the politically motivated so-called Black Legend, and take a closer look at the indigenous peoples who played a decisive role in bringing down Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, and which modern activists choose to ignore. Their role played just as, if not more important than the Spanish or Aztecs, the consequences of which gave birth to the modern Mexican peoples. The conquests were far more complicated than many have been led to believe, so join us as we separate fact from fiction and uncover what everyone gets wrong about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. In Queen Isabella of Spain's testament given at Medina del Campo, dated October 12, 1504, she says the following. Inasmuch as at the time when the Apostolic See granted us the islands and mainland of the ocean sea, discovered and yet to be discovered, our principal intention, when we petitioned Pope Alexander VI of blessed memory, who made us the said concession, was to endeavor to induce and bring the peoples thereof, and convert them to our holy Catholic faith, and to send to the said islands and mainland of the ocean sea prelates and religious and clerics and other learned and God-fearing persons, to instruct the inhabitants and dwellers therein in the Catholic faith, and to teach and train them in good customs, and to apply due diligence therein, as is set forth at greater length in the letters of said concession. Therefore, I most earnestly beseech the king, my lord, and I charge and command the said princess, my daughter, and the said prince, her husband, that they do so and fulfill it, and that this be their principal aim, and that they place great diligence therein, and do not allow or give occasion that the Indians, inhabitants, and dwellers in the said Indies and mainland, gained and yet to be gained, should suffer any injury in their persons or property. But I command that they be justly and well treated, and if they have suffered any injury, let it be remedied and provided for in such a way that nothing be done contrary to what by the apostolic letters of the said concession is enjoined and commanded to us." End quote. Here we see from the Spanish Queen herself the legislation which animated the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Thus, even if we are to encounter offenses against the native inhabitants, these offenses would be departing from Spain's official policy. With that, let's commence. As most are aware, the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus first discovered the Americas for Spain in 1492 when he landed on the island of Hispaniola. This island is where the modern-day countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. The Spanish would later settle the other Caribbean islands, including Cuba. The Spanish had heard rumors of powerful and wealthy nations still further west. Around 1511, Jerónimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero survived a shipwreck off the Yucatan Peninsula. They lived among the Mayan people of that region for years, with Guerrero becoming fully integrated, marrying a woman with whom he had 3 children and becoming a Mayan warlord. Because of this, Guerrero is sometimes referred to as the father of the mestizos. Diego Velázquez, then governor of Cuba, would send another expedition to the Yucatan, headed by a Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517. They met with some Mayans and fought, losing about half their men, forcing a retreat back to Cuba, where Córdoba would die of his injuries. Despite this, the information gathered from this ill-fated expedition caused further interest in future expeditions. To follow up on this expedition, Velázquez sent another one in 1518, this time headed by a Juan de Grijalva. He made it further than the previous expedition, sailing along much of the Gulf of Mexico and encountering not only Mayan people but also Totonacs. This expedition further increased interest in exploring the region. In none of these previously mentioned expeditions were permanent Spanish settlements established, though. Enter Hernando Cortés. Cortés was born to a minor noble family in Medellin, Spain in 1485. He studied in Salamanca, though left without attaining a degree. Becoming aware of the discoveries being made in the New World, his ambition led him to desire to go there himself. Initially, an injury he sustained prevented him from going when the opportunity presented itself, but he was later able to set sail when another opportunity presented itself in 1504, when he first settled in Hispaniola. Here he served as notary, later participating in the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez. He would be appointed mayor of Santiago de Cuba. It is true, in the beginning Velázquez and Cortés had a good relationship. The relationship, though, would become rocky with time. Initially, Cortés had met a certain Catalina Suarez, a relative of Velázquez, whom he promised to marry. As time went, though, he did not keep this promise. This caused some consternation and rebuking from her family. At length, Cortés did eventually marry her, thus putting himself in the good graces of her family, including Velázquez, for the time being. Informed of the information gathered from the previous expeditions, Velázquez resolved to put in motion another expedition to the Yucatan. But he needed to find someone to head it. Considering multiple candidates, Cortés was eventually able to win the position. This caused some jealousy among his countrymen. These same jealous persons attempted to fan the flames of resentment and distrust in Velázquez, so that he might reverse his decision to have elected Cortés for the job in favor of someone else. Cortés caught wind of this conspiracy to snatch this opportunity from him and consented to setting sail as soon as possible. Thus, Cortés set sail from Santiago de Cuba, November 18, 1518, at dawn for Macaca and Trinidad to pick up volunteers and supplies. It is said Velázquez raced to the port as Cortés was leaving, confused as to why he was leaving so abruptly. Cortés is reported as saying, "Pardon me, time passes, and there are some things that should be done before they are even thought of. Has your excellency any commands?" End quote. Velázquez did not give him any commands. Thus, the claim that Cortés knowingly disobeyed lawful authority when he set sail for Yucatan is a patent falsehood. Not only this, but the authorities in Hispaniola, a higher authority than the governorship of Cuba, had already recognized Cortés as captain general of the expedition. Thus, it could be argued it wouldn't make a difference even if the claim were true. Having secured all his men and supplies at the Cape of San Antonio, 110 mariners, 533 soldiers, 32 crossbowmen, 13 arquebusiers, and 200 indigenous men of the islands, including some women, 16 horses, and among these men even included Africans. One of these was Juan Garrido. Born in the Congo, he traveled to Lisbon, Portugal as a young man and embraced Christianity. He had come to the New World in 1510 and was now embarking on this expedition in which he would gain much notoriety. He was not only a warrior but a pioneer, as he would become the first person to sow wheat in the Americas. All of the men thus assembled and ready to go, they celebrated Catholic Mass, placed the fleet under the protection of St. Peter, Cortés's patron saint, and departed the 18th day of February 1519 for the Yucatan. Their first destination, the island of Cozumel. Landing at Cozumel after the rest of his men, Cortés was made aware that one of his captains, Pedro de Alvarado, had taken it upon himself to rifle through the Mayan temples and violently take various ornaments, frightening the natives and causing them to hide. Cortés, incensed by this conduct, severely reprimanded Alvarado. He commanded the 2 Mayans taken by Alvarado to be brought before him. He apologized to them profusely for their mistreatment and explained to them the specific reason for their visit. This was done through an interpreter by the name of Melchorejo, a native of the Yucatan who had been brought back to Cuba by the Grijalva expedition, where he learned some Spanish. Cortés then sent them away loaded with presents and a message of goodwill to the natives. This method worked, as the locals of Cozumel soon came out and mingled with the newly arrived Spaniards. It is at Cozumel where the first converts to Christianity were made through the preaching of Mercedarian Father Bartolomé de Olmedo. This priest would accompany the entire expedition and on many occasions would prove to be a level-headed friend to the natives, pleading the conquistadors to take the most humane decisions in their regard. And herein lies the difference between the colonial projects of the Spanish as compared to other Western powers, for example, the English. In the case of the latter, one could say it was open season on the native inhabitants with rare or non-existent mitigations to their sufferings. In the case of the former, even in cases where we see mistreatment, as no conflict is immune from all instances of mistreatment, we are always met with Catholic priests or monks there also pleading for the humane treatment of the natives, the conversion of non-believers before any other consideration, and there were other considerations, but conversion was the main consideration behind Spanish exploration. Without it, they would not have taken place. While on Cozumel, of course, Cortés meant to make contact with the Spaniards who had been shipwrecked in the region for nearly a decade. Guerrero, having a wife, kids, and becoming accustomed to the way of life, decided to stay. Aguilar joined the conquistadors. Aguilar would prove a well-welcomed additional translator, having learned a variety of Mayan dialects during his stay in the region. From Cozumel, the Spaniards sailed along the Yucatan coast proper and landed near Tabasco. Landing here, they were met by the local Chontal Maya people, who were hostile. Unlike the peaceful inhabitants of Cozumel, they threw spears and arrows on the newly arrived Spaniards. Cortés, therefore, approached within hearing distance of them, and through his interpreter, had the requerimiento read to them. The requerimiento, or requirement, was a declaration of the Spanish monarchy written by Juan López de Palacios Rubios in 1513. In it is stated Castile's claims to the lands in the Americas, brief legal and religious justifications for such claims are given, and peace is offered to the natives, while warning that if they don't make peace, battle will ensue in which they will inevitably be defeated. This declaration was read to the natives before every battle, or potential battle, in accord with Spanish law. Thus the Spaniards never engaged the natives while they were totally unawares. The requerimiento was always read to them first, thus peace was always offered to them first. The reading of the requerimiento in this instance had no effect on these Chontal Maya Tabascans, who sent back war cries and arrows in response. Thus the Spaniards gave them battle and eventually defeated them, though with no little difficulty. The Tabascans, thus being defeated, gave the Spaniards around 20 female slaves as a peace offering, and peace was made. One of these women would turn out to be one of the greatest assets in the Spaniards' retinue, her legacy continuing to be debated to this day. The Spaniards continued along the coast to the island of San Juan de Ulua, thus named during the previous Grijalva expedition. It's at this island where the Spaniards were met with friendly natives bringing gifts inspired by accounts of the Spaniards spread by their countrymen who had traded with Grijalva. However, Cortés was baffled when he was unable to communicate with these people. His main translator, Aguilar, was not familiar with the language they spoke. The Mayan dialects he was familiar with bore little resemblance to the Aztec. It was at this moment Cortés was informed that one of the women given by the Tabascans was an Aztec, familiar with the language and that of the Mayan dialects. Thus a conversation took place, with the woman translating into Maya and Aguilar translating into Spanish. Aguilar's use would later in the conquest be rendered unnecessary, as this woman herself would learn Spanish. This woman's name was Melantzin, or, as the Spaniards affectionately referred to her as, Doña Marina. Melantzin was likely from Panayla in the region around Coatzacoalcos and born probably in 1500 into a noble Nahua-speaking family. Her father, a powerful Tlatoani or chief, died when she was young, and her mother remarried. With this second husband, she had a son and conceived a detestable idea of transferring to him Melantzin's rightful inheritance. To do this, She feigned that her daughter had died while secretly selling her off to some merchants. These merchants sold her to the Tlalochthuanik, or Mayan chief of Tabasco, and as we have seen, he delivered her to the Spaniards. It is, of course, in Tabasco where she became familiar with the Mayan dialects. Melancin's intellectual prowess is said to have been matched by her looks, as many a historian and poet have commented on her beauty. Even Cortez would be smitten, as he and her would later have a son. Melancin's importance in the conquest cannot be overstated, as she was an interpreter, diplomat, advisor, and informant on the various cultures and politics of the peoples the Spaniards encountered. Her deep understanding of the local context were matched by her deep loyalty to the Spanish cause. It was at her Christian baptism that she received the name Doña Marina. Now being able to discuss with these people, Cortez learned that they were subjects of the Mexica, or Aztec Empire. He was able to gather some intelligence on the state of affairs through this communication and sent the ambassadors back with the gifts to their governor and stated his desire to meet with the Emperor Moctezuma II. Cortez and Aztec ambassadors would continue to meet throughout the Spaniards' journey to the capital, in which gifts would continue to be exchanged. Moctezuma, insisting the Spaniards not come, for he feared they were the prophesied beings who were to take his empire, and Cortez insisting a meeting between the two take place. The Spaniards were later approached by some natives of Sempoala. These were the Totonac people. Their land had recently been conquered by the Aztec Empire, under which they were oppressed and groaned for liberation. Cortez sent them ambassadors back with gifts and promised to pay them a visit. At this time, Velázquez, governor of Cuba, had turned against Cortez through jealousy. Many of Cortez's men felt betrayed that Cortez had not yet established a colony of his own, as seemed necessary to the mission they were embarking on. At length, Cortez relented and established the colony of Villarica de Veracruz, somewhat near the modern city of Veracruz. By doing so, the legality of the enterprise was now a settled matter, as now it was under the direct jurisdiction of the Crown of Spain, not Velázquez. The Spaniards now marched to Sempoala. On the way, they passed through some abandoned towns in which there were temples, in which they first encountered the bloody, mutilated corpses that would be all too familiar to them throughout the conquest. They encountered that staple of the Aztec religion, human sacrifice. The Spaniards eventually entered Sempoala, a town of around 20 to 30,000 inhabitants. Cortez met with the Tlatoani, Xicomecoatl, telling him, first, of his great desire to convert his inhabitants to Christianity. Cortez also assured Xicomecoatl that he had been sent by the King of Spain to redress abuses and to punish the oppressor, promising that if the Totonacs stayed true to him, together they would throw off the yoke of the Aztecs. Cortez and the Spaniards would witness firsthand the oppression the Totonacs endured at the hands of the Aztecs when the following day, 5 Aztec nobles entered the city. These demanded of the Totonacs 20 young men and women to offer as sacrifice to their gods. Cortez displayed indignation at this demand and insisted that the Totonacs refuse and instead arrest the Aztecs and have them thrown into prison, which they did. At night, Cortez secured the escape of 2 of them, apologizing for their treatment and sending them away with well wishes to Moctezuma. The escape of these so incensed the Totonacs that they resolved to sacrifice the remaining 3 prisoners, had Cortez not disallowed it and sent these 2 back to Moctezuma. At any rate, Cortez had messengers sent to all the Totonac towns, telling them to refuse any further payment of tribute to Moctezuma. The astonished natives of the region cheered, as now it seemed they had hope in the Spanish to liberate them from Aztec oppression. After having built some buildings at Veracruz, Xicomecoatl, Tlatoani of Sempoala, asked the Spaniards to aid him in a dispute with a neighboring city. Cortez marched with a part of his men to support. En route, one Morla, a common soldier, took it upon himself to rob a native of a couple of fowls. As we've seen in the past, Cortez's indignation at any ill treatment meted out to the natives by his men, this case was no different. Cortez demanded that Morla at once be hung up on the roadside in front of everyone. Fortunately for Morla, he was cut down by Pedro de Alvarado, thinking a sufficient example had been made while there was yet still life in him. On reaching the hostile city, the Spaniards were welcomed amicably, and peace between the two concerned parties was made without any bloodshed. All of the Totonacs were now united in their alliance with the Spaniards. It was around this time that Cortés had his fleet sunk so as to commit his men to the expedition. Some say they were set on fire, but this is not true. They were merely scuttled. Even then, at least one of the boats was preserved for anyone truly lacking the wherewithal to remain in the country. Thus being committed to the conquest, the Spaniards, 400 foot and 15 horse, continued their march to Mexico. The Tlatoani of Sempoala gave around 2,300 men for the expedition, which were of essential service throughout the march. The rest of the Spaniards stayed at Villarica de Veracruz under the command of Juan de Escalante. Cortés recommended the Totonac chiefs to apply to this officer in case of any difficulty, assuring them, as long as they stayed true to their new sovereign and religion, they'd have the faithful protection of the Spaniards. The next place they arrived at was Tlatlauquitepec. This place was subject to the Aztec Empire. The chief here recommended they go to the capital by way of the city of Cholula. However, Cortés' Totonac allies recommended against this route, saying the Cholulans were a hostile and perfidious people. They instead recommended going through Tlaxcala, an independent republic. The indigenous allies persuaded Cortés, and this was the route he ended up deciding on. Some mention should be made on who are the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans came onto the plateau around the same time as the other Nahua-speaking groups, around the close of the 12th century. Initially, they had one monarch, but later they split this into two monarchs, and then four, who each ruled over the four city-states, or altepetl, of Ocotelulco, Tizatlan, Quihuitztlan, and Tepeticpac. The republic functioned as a confederation with a shared council composed of nobles and warriors from the four constituent city-states. Political power was somewhat collective, though certain families held influence. Tlaxcala had its own army, religion, and social hierarchy similar to the other Nahua states. Surrounded by Aztecs and other states, and though not ambitious of foreign conquest, the prosperity of the Tlaxcalans soon excited the jealousy of its neighbors, especially the opulent city of Cholula, with whom they would have frequent hostilities, though with the Tlaxcalans almost always being victorious. Later, the Aztec Empire would set its sights on Tlaxcala, as most of the other city-states in the region had already been subsumed into the Aztec Empire, most apart from those of the independent Tlaxcalans. Under Ahiacatl, emperor of the Aztecs demanded of the Tlaxcalans the same tribute rendered to them as by the others. Tlaxcala refused. Thus, never-ending battles between the two peoples ensued. All captives were mercilessly sacrificed. Tlaxcalan children were raised to have an undying hatred for the Aztecs, and vice versa. Aztecs did not intermarry with the Tlaxcalans as they did with the other Nahua peoples. The Tlaxcalans later received support from the Otomis, a warlike people originally spread over the tableland north of the Mexican Valley. A portion of these obtained settlement in the Republic and were incorporated in its armies. The Aztec army, for its part, cut off all communication and trade into the independent Republic. Due to this, for more than half a century, they had neither cacao, cotton, nor salt. In fact, it took a lapse of several generations after the conquest for the Tlaxcalans to become acclimated to the use of salt during meals due to this. And thus was the condition of the Tlaxcalans on the Spaniards' arrival at their doorstep. Cortés had sent Totonac allies as ambassadors to the Tlaxcalans, asking for safe passage. The arrival of the Christians at Tlaxcala's borders caused some debate at their great council. Some were of the opinion that the Christians were those beings prophesied to come by their oracles. They were enemies of the Mexica and perhaps might help the Tlaxcalans in their struggle against that empire. Others were of the opinion that the Christians could not be trusted had not they left a trail of broken religious images and desecrated temples in their wake. And who knows if they're really enemies of the Mexica? After all, they've been receiving the embassies of Moctezuma and were now in the company of his vassals on the way to his capital. These last sentiments were those of one of the four chiefs, Ixtlilxochitl, an aged and nearly blind chieftain of over 100 years of age. His son, an impetuous young man of the same name, commanded an army of Otomi and Tlaxcalan warriors near the eastern frontier. Ixtlilxochitl surmised that the best option was to use these to attack the Christians. If victorious, the Christians would be in their power. If defeated, the Senate could just disown the act as that of the general, not of the Republic. This was the stratagem that was chosen. The Totonac envoys, for their part, were detained by the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans thus attacked the Spaniards and Totonacs. Many a battle and intermittent skirmishes ensued. Up till this point, the Spaniards had not encountered warriors as strong as the Tlaxcalans, but the Spanish were able to gain the upper hand. Cortés sent an embassy to the Tlaxcalans, asking for their submission. Mexicatl, one of the four chiefs, argued again in favor of embracing peace and the proffered alliance with the Spaniards. The armies had been beaten back too far, rendering resistance futile, he argued. He also pointed to how Cortés had sent back prisoners, so unusual in that region, as another motive to form an alliance with these people who apparently knew how to be both friend and foe. Mexicatl was, however, overruled by the war party. The battles with the Spanish would continue. The Tlaxcalans attacked at night, thinking they might catch the Spaniards unawares, as nocturnal warfare was very uncommon in that region. This design, too, failed. The next day, about 50 Tlaxcalan entered the Spanish camp with gifts, saying they were sent by the general who was ready to make peace. These were allowed to stay, but after 2 days, these same excited some distrust in Melancin, Doña Marina. She in turn communicated to Cortés that she suspected them to be spies. Cortés caused several of them to be arrested and individually examined, through which it was confirmed they had been sent by the general Ixtlilxochitl to inform him on the state of the camp, preparatory for an assault. Cortés meant to make an example of these, so he had their hands cut off and sent them back to their countrymen. This treatment may seem shocking to some, but it must be remembered that these were spies. Therefore, the laws of war, whether among, quote, civilized or, quote, savage alike, they would incur the death penalty. Losing one's hands is a far cry from being put to death. Further, in the context of the 16th century, this punishment certainly does not sink below the standard practice. At any rate, the message was enough to demoralize the Tlaxcalans in their continued efforts to vanquish the Spaniards and their Totonac allies. Peace was finally made between the two parties. Now the Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and Spaniards were united in a common cause. The Tlaxcalans would turn out to be perhaps the greatest allies to the Spaniards throughout the entire conquest. The Tlaxcalans too warned Cortés against taking the route through Cholula. They too warned of their perfidy and craft. While so many a distant place had sent to Cortés and Tlaxcala to testify goodwill and offer allegiance, Cholula, merely 6 leagues away, had done neither. One of those who sent his regards to Cortés was Ixtlilxochitl, son of the great Nezahualpóyotl, Tlatoani of Texcoco. Ixtlilxochitl was an unsuccessful competitor to his older brother, Cacamatzin, to the Texcocan throne, but he retained at least part of the kingdom, ruling it over with animosity towards his brother and Moctezuma, who sustained him. He now offered his services, asking aid in return to place him upon the throne of his ancestors. It was not long before messengers from Cholula arrived, inviting Cortés to their city. These messengers were of low degree, far beneath the usual rank of ambassadors. This was pointed out by the Tlaxcalans. Cortés demanded that they send their principal men, or he would deal with them as rebels. This had its desired effect. Soon, some of Cholula's highest nobles entered Tlaxcala, offering the same invitation as before. The Tlaxcalans were now more than ever opposed to entering Cholula. They had ascertained that a strong Aztec force lay in the neighborhood of Cholula. and that the people were actively placing the city in a defensive posture. In other words, they suspected it to be a trap. These suspicions, of course, disturbed Cortés. Nonetheless, he decided to move forward with the visit. Tlaxcala is said to have offered 100,000 men on this occasion. Cortés, while showing gratitude, however, only chose 6,000 of these. Cortés left the majority of these just outside of Cholula, as the Cholulans were too disturbed at having their rivals within their city. The Tlaxcalans once again cautioned him about the Cholulans before he entered that city, with no other native allies than the Totonacs from Sempoya and a small handful of Tlaxcalans carrying baggage. Initially, they were all warmly welcomed by the Cholulans, but within a few days the scene began to change. Their visit, it seemed, had drawn the ire of the Mexica. No longer did the Cholulans visit the Spaniards in their quarters, even when invited to do so. No longer did the Cholulans supply them with provisions. While wandering around the city, the Totonacs observed several streets barricaded, the roofs of houses loaded with stones and other missiles as if preparatory to an assault. And in other places, they found holes covered over with branches, with upright sharp stakes within. The Tlaxcalans stationed without informed Cortés that in another quarter the Cholulans had offered a great sacrifice, mostly of children, apparently for some intended purpose. In addition, they had seen a number of women and children leaving the city, as if to find a place of safety. This all, of course, disturbed Cortés, but he still wanted greater proof that a treachery was indeed being meditated. Meanwhile, Malintzin, Doña Marina, and her amiable manners had won for her the trust of the wife of one of the city's chiefs, who repeatedly invited her to visit her home, intimating that it would serve as an escape. Malintzin pretended that she too loathed the Spaniards, so as to gain further confidence and draw a full account of the conspiracy. She was told that the conspiracy originated with none other than Moctezuma. The Spaniards were to be attacked as they marched out of the city, and 20,000 Mexica warriors were already stationed within the vicinity to help with the assault if need be. Malintzin was able to leave this meeting and went to Cortés to inform him of the conspiracy, who immediately had the chief's wife arrested. Upon interrogation, she fully confirmed the statement of Malintzin. Cortés yet still wanted further confirmation of the conspiracy before making a decision related to it. Thus he invited 2 priests of the city to his quarters. Through liberal gifts, he was able to get a confession from them as well. They said Moctezuma had ordered the Cholulans to at first be welcoming to the visitors. After consulting his oracles, though, he then supposedly received the answer that Cholula was to be the grave of the visitors. Cortés dismissed the priests and charged them with secrecy. He told them they would be leaving the following day and requested a meeting with the principal chiefs of the city. In said meeting, he rebuked them for their want of hospitality and informed them they'd be leaving the next morning. On their departure, he summoned the Mexica ambassadors. He briefly told them he was fully aware of their conspiracy. The ambassadors, for their part, claimed they and Moctezuma were wholly ignorant of the conspiracy, which they fully blamed on the Cholulans themselves. Cortés, not wanting to sour relations with Moctezuma, intimated he believed their claim and declared he would make an example of the Cholulans for the injuries done both to him and Moctezuma. In the morning, Cortés had the principal Cholulans assemble. He charged them all with the conspiracy, showing he was well acquainted with all the details. The Spaniards had entered the city as a friend, had been more than respectful to its inhabitants, even stationing the Tlaxcalans outside so as not to offend the Cholulans. In exchange for this, the Cholulans had pretended to reciprocate, while in secret placed them into a deadly trap. The Cholulans were awestruck at the accusation, as if it were uttered by one with the ability to read minds. They confessed the entire conspiracy, but threw the blame upon Moctezuma. Cortés said even if their claim were true, it'd be no justification for their part in it. He now declared he would make an example of them. A slaughter then commenced. The Cholulans outside of the courtyard, hearing the slaughter take place, then began attacking the Spaniards from without. The Tlaxcalans, remember being outside of the city, now hearing the battle take place, advanced to the city and assaulted the Cholulans' rear. It's worth mentioning But despite the activity going on, Cortez's order to not attack women or children was abided by. However, some Tlaxcalans did take some as prisoners. After some hours, in deference to the Mexica ambassadors, Cortez called off his soldiers. About 6,000 men had perished in this conflict. Cortez's first move at restoring peace was to get his Tlaxcalan allies to release the prisoners they had seized. The Tlaxcalans obeyed, though with reserve. The city was then cleaned of dead bodies. Cortez then assisted the Cholulans in installing a successor to the principal chief. Moctezuma sent ambassadors to Cortez, disavowing any participation in the conspiracy. Cortez was not able to impress upon the Cholulans to embrace Christianity, citizens of one of the principal cities of the Aztec religion. At any rate, Father Olmedo dissuaded him from making any such attempt until the reduction of the whole country. Cortez was, however, able to free the captives reserved for sacrifice from their cages. The massacre of Cholula, as it has become known, is one of, if not the principal misdeed attributed to the Spaniards in the conquest. But as we've seen, there really was a conspiracy, which was confirmed both by the Aztecs and Cholulans themselves, not to mention Malincin and the allies of the Spaniards. Far from being a spur-of-the-moment, senseless massacre, the truth is indeed more nuanced. The Spaniards and their indigenous allies thus continued their journey, coming down the mountains into the Valley of Mexico. Everywhere they were welcomed kindly by the inhabitants, and everywhere they heard complaints about Moctezuma. Cortez told them to rely on his protection, for he had come to redress wrongs. It's on the 8th of November, 1519, that they first stepped foot in the capital of Tenochtitlan, a city which could well have been considered the capital of the Western world. Cortez had with him 6,000 Tlaxcalan allies, along with a few Totonac and other indigenous allies. Cortez was met by Emperor Moctezuma, and the men were given warm hospitality and rest for the time being. And with that, we will end the first episode. In the next episode, we will discuss the truth of who the Aztecs are and give some background about them. Then in the episode after that, we will continue the story of the Spaniards' arrival in Tenochtitlan up to the fall of that city. Thanks for watching, and until next time.